Welcome to Session 11, Part 1, The Church as a Plantation's High Priest and False Prophet.
How you doing today, Haley?
I'm doing great.
Good. So what do we mean by the church is the high priest and false prophet of the plantation system?
I think what we mean is that the church is the reputation launderer.
The reputation launderer, like it's dirty laundry in, clean laundry out. It's
Right.
kind of like once you give philanthropically, then like you get to put your name on buildings and it looks all nice and shiny, like you're benefiting everybody.
How could anybody think that you're doing something so wrong when you do something that's very visibly right?
Hmm. And then you get to put your name on a pew or a building or a scholarship fund or something like that. Got it.
Mhm.
Yes, reputation laundering.
Yeah, I have a good example of this here. This is in a series of tweets from Diane Langberg. She talks about the Cape Coast Castle that held hundreds of thousands of humans who were forced through the dungeons and through the door of no return onto slave ships. But directly above the people who were shackled in the dungeon, and some of them were dead and others were screaming, and they were all filthy. Directly above that was a church where they sang and they read scripture and prayed, maybe took up an offering for those who were less fortunate. And if you were enslaved underneath, you could hear the songs to God. And if you were above, sometimes perhaps you could hear the slave scream, but maybe there were people down there keeping them quiet. And so the people who were up above were numb to the trauma and the suffering that was happening below them. And that is reputation laundering. You build a church on top of your dungeon.
Thanks for bringing that to my attention because that is just poetically it's a savage thing that happened, right? Like this is the Cape Coast Castle on the coast of Ghana. It was the last stop on before people went on the transatlantic trade, and so the slaves were collected there. Um, the ship crew and everyone needed a last kind of like, this is our last chance to worship God and have a good meal.
Right. The transatlantic slave trade. It's the organized crime ring of human trafficking.
And the church was the reputation launderer, right? The church stepped in, covered the dungeon, covered over the screams, made
Mhm.
it all okay. And you could just hear the
Right.
justifications, right? Then and now of, well, at least we were sharing the gospel with these people, even though actually we're learning now that West Africa probably had 20%, up to 20% of its population already Catholic, which is why the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina was Catholic led, right? It was African American Catholics. So like there's a clear connection. Everything was a lie, a lie. And it brings to my mind many passages where God says, "Don't make me your reputation launderer," essentially, right? Don't make me part of this racket. Like you're racketeering, and I'm not complicit in that. And so here's one of the passages, Deuteronomy 23. None of this is verses 17 through 20. None of the daughters of Israel shall serve in an illicit shrine, and none of the sons of Israel shall serve in an illicit shrine. You shall not bring the fee of a prostitute or the wages of a dog into the house of the Lord your God in payment for any vow, for both of these are abhorrent to the Lord your God. So in other words, like the offering plate or the kind of the context of worship is not the thing that launders how you got this money in the first place. How you got really matters. It matters to God before you give it.
Right.
So God says, no, this is not okay. I do not turn a blind eye to how you got all this wealth.
It's been happening for a long time. It's been happening consistently. So,
Okay.
I'm really curious about dogs in that verse. What does that mean? We kind of like dogs now. That's mean to dogs.
It is a little mean to dogs.
Yeah.
Um, I I think in context, well, it is difficult to say because this is presumably the oldest kind of place that this happened. So what this meant back then is probably the wages of a vicious person, right? Like a dog, like a wild and like kind of a wild animal. And in context, I think it actually refers forward to verse 19 and 20, which is someone who charges interest on a loan, especially to poor people, but to any other Israelite, right? So in verse 19, he goes on, you shall not charge interest on loans to another Israelite, interest on money, interest on provisions, interest on anything that is lent.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think that has a lot to say about indebtedness today and how vicious it is and certainly can be. But the idea is God cares about how you got the money. Don't
Mm.
don't think that God just turns away and says, "Hmm, whatever."
It's it's been happening for a while then, so it sounds like it's something that we need to look out for. We should be careful that the money and resources that we get are gotten in ways that are fair and equitable to everybody, because God doesn't, he's not like, it's fine, whatever. Just, I know you got it in a bad way, but you're giving it to me, so it's fine. He doesn't, no, he doesn't work that way.
Exactly, exactly. There's a kind of an older stereotype, maybe it's from the Godfather movies, and what's depicted there is kind of this collusion between the Catholic Church
Mm.
and the mafia, right? The
Mhm.
organized mob, and like the mafia don or the mafia family brings in the money that they've collected and extorted, and then they put a little in the offering plate.
Right.
And I think, you know, for Protestants, we look at that and we think, oh, that's obvious racketeering. Like, and you're making the church into this agent of collusion, and you're making God into this agent of collusion. And yet we we don't turn that critique honestly on ourselves, turning the spotlight honestly on ourselves. And, we have let the church be the reputation launderer.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, tale as old as time, true as it can be, barely even friends. Then somebody bends unexpectedly. That's really chilling, actually, when you set those words in the context of what the church has been doing for the unjust, for the enslavers.
Right, right. Now we had thought about kind of playing a game of Jeopardy and
Mhm.
making this a little interesting because we wanted to highlight how do Christian elites justify the plantation elites
Mhm.
nowadays, and then how has that happened throughout history?
Right, right. Here's your daily double, Mako, and you must answer in the form of a question.
Oh,
This
okay.
This evangelical historian isn't, just makes stuff up. So he depicted Thomas Jefferson, who actually endorsed a wall between church and state, as an enthusiast of America as a Christian nation.
Oh, who is David Barton?
Yes, you're right.
Yes, yes. He's alive today. Here's some really interesting other little factoids for our audience here. Barton has this book called The Jefferson Lies,
Oh.
and he claims that modern scholars and kind of the secular left have promoted lies about Jefferson, like this wall between church and state. Because what does David Barton want? He wants no separation.
Mhm.
Um, and so viewers of here are some things that people have said about the Jefferson lies. In particular, viewers of the History Channel voted this book, quote, the least credible history book in print.
Right.
10 conservative Christian professors denounced its totally unsupported claims. And then in 2012, his own publisher, Thomas Nelson Publishing, stopped publishing that book because it had so many inaccuracies and false claims. Thomas Nelson had said that it had, quote, lost confidence in the book's details.
Is that the origin of that picture of all of his books in a dumpster? They just threw them all away.
I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah. They're like, this is worthless. We don't.
when your publisher dumpsters all your books, you might be a bad historian.
You might be. I mean, you might be a bad
You might
publisher too.
not
I mean,
be a
what-
historian. You may not be a historian if your publisher had to throw all your books away on history.
Right. Well, I don't think David Barton has an advanced degree in history, so it shows. When it comes to other topics, right? He called Native Americans terrorists for defending their own land. So in this video, he defends the U.S. genocide of American Indians. That's what it's titled. And he justifies the mass killing of buffalo as this really good step to defeating the tribes in the open Western Plains. So let's just watch this. I mean, I understand this is, and then we'll comment on it on the other side.
So a lot of it is based on what you have to do to secure justice and to secure the protection of life and liberties for your citizens. And you do what you have to do at times, but you play on the rules sometimes the other guys have set up. And if they're not going to negotiate with things like the Geneva Treaty or other rules of civilization, you still have to secure the life and the property and the protection of your citizens. That you have to deal a lot of it with how the enemy responds. It's got to be based on what the enemy responds. You cannot reason with certain type of terrorists. You cannot reason with, and see, that's why we could not get the Indians to the table to negotiate with us on treaties until after we had thoroughly whipped so many tribes. What happened was the Indian leader said, they're trying to change our culture. And so they declared war on all the white guys and went after the white guys. And that was King Philip's War. It was really trying to be civilized on one side and end torture. And the Indians were threatened by the Indian of torture. And so we had to go in and we had to destroy Indian tribes all over until they said, oh, got the point. You're doing to us what we're doing to them. Okay, we'll sign a treaty. Take, for example, what happened in the Western Plains Wars in the late 1800s when we were taking on the Plains Indians. And I'm not talking about treaties, not talking about behavior of Americans toward Indians or vice versa. There were violations on both sides of nearly every treaty. I'm talking about what happened in ending those wars, after Custer and everything that went on. People complain about the fact that the American military and buffalo hunters went out and wiped out all the buffalo in the Western Plains. Doing that was what brought the Indians to their knees, because the Indians living on those wide western plains where there were very few towns, Indians didn't go into town and buy supplies. They went to the buffalo herds. That's where they got their meat. That's where they got their coats. The hides provided coats that provided covering for their teepees. If you don't have those buffaloes, those Indians cannot live in the open western plains without the buffalo. And so what happened was the military wiped out the supply line by wiping out the buffalo. That's what brought those wars to an end. That's what brought the Indians to their knees and ended all the western conflict.
Yeah, that's really maddening. I don't think David Barton would like for me to come to his house and take all his food away. And then for me to say, well, I had to. How else was I going to make you stop fighting me and make you leave? And he's like, but you came to my house. And I'm like, I did what I had to do.
I did what I had to
your house.
Well, he plays the civilization card. I mean, who's more civilized? So, if you're defending civilization and justice, well, then the colonists, the Europeans, are totally in the right, aren't they? Aren't they? Aren't they, Haley?
I thought if you're Christians, it's like level one thinking that you are not allowed to go to other people's places and take their stuff and tell them it's for their own good.
I know, right? There's a few commandments that would be
really not supposed to do that. That's really, really basic. Most people know not to do that.
Yeah. Well, and this is part of, I think, the reason why, after I listened to that clip, I felt dumber. Like, gosh, King Philip's War was all about what?
The English Puritans were not as open-minded as the Dutch. They believed God had led them to this new land, and it was rightfully theirs. They vilified the natives, equating them with the devil and labeling them as savages that needed taming. They believed that the diseases brought by the Europeans that ravaged the native population were God's way of punishing the natives for their blasphemy. In telling stories of behavior abhorrent to Puritan sensibilities, they absolved themselves, leaving their consciences clear, but their hands bloody.
The English colonists were encroaching on native lands. They're coming up the rivers, right? The Merrimack River, the Connecticut River, and then they were letting their animals graze on native lands, even when there was like treaty after treaty, conversation after conversation, trying to like narrow down, like, look, what are the boundaries here? So yes, so King Philip's War started. But again, it was because natives were defending their lands from treaty breakers. And it is just the height of hypocrisy and cultural imperialism to say that they didn't have civilization. Native Americans didn't have
Really is.
civilization.
Yeah, it really is. People who live, I don't even like to say them or the natives. There are people who were here. They lived here.
Right.
They were from here. They have every right to be here. And then you don't come in and get rid of all of their food by shooting all of their food, which, by the way, is food that anybody could eat. You could have had buffalo for yourself and survived. You shoot them all, so the people who are already there don't have what they need to live.
Right.
It's
Right.
psychopathic behavior.
It is, and it's crazy. It's the reputation laundering of the English colonists by now demeaning Native Americans. If the Wampanoag people had not taught the Pilgrims how to farm on rocky soil, the Pilgrims would have just died. And then what about the role of the Iroquois Confederation on the founders of the U.S. Constitution? So there's a book by James Wilson called The Earth Shall Weep, A History of Native America, which recounts this meeting between Iroquois leaders and colonial leaders from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Maryland back in 1744. And then the native leader, Canestego, gets frustrated at the colonists quarreling with each other. He says this: "We heartily recommend union and a good agreement between you, our brethren." He advised that they follow the example of the Iroquois, who had established a well-organized system of self-government codified in the Great Law of Peace, with both a central council and checks and balances that protected individual freedoms. He said, "We are a powerful confederacy, and by observing the same methods our wise forefathers have taken, you will acquire fresh strength and power." Benjamin Franklin was taking notes there. And he later wrote in like a letter in 1751, he said, if, quote, ignorant savages, that's his language, could form such an effective union, the English colonies should be able to do the same. When the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, John Adams gave everyone a 3-volume handbook surveying different types of governments, and it included the Iroquois Confederacy and other indigenous governments, which many of the delegates knew not just by his writing, but through personal experience. That's why in 1988, the U.S. Congress finally passed a resolution saying, look, our founding was influenced by the Iroquois Confederacy. It says, whereas the original framers of the Constitution, including most notably George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, are known to have greatly admired the concepts of the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, and whereas the confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles which were incorporated into the Constitution itself. Sadly, not the right of women to vote. Like these are people who, quote, had no civilization? Like, what are you talking about?
They had civilization. It's all a lie. It's reputation laundering. You need to believe something like that so you can launder your reputation. Why? Because you went and you basically chained up somebody's refrigerator and their pantry and tried to starve them out of their own home. So you need to call it something else.
Yes, yes. You know, these things about the past are kind of, David Barton brings them in service of his real project, which is he thinks that Protestants are more entitled to run the United States than anyone else. Right. And then he's trying to kind of launder everyone's reputation. So he says, oh, the founding fathers of the US were abolitionists. even though they were slaveholders.
Right.
Anyway, and they separated from Great Britain because they wanted to abolish slavery, even though Great Britain
Not
did
true.
it in 1807 and then 1833, and then without firing a shot in a civil war, right? Like, that's how they did it.
It's
Like,
actually, literally not true.
just to steel man some of David Barton's, arguments. He quotes at length, for example, from George Washington's farewell address, and he says, like, look, he's promoting Christianity, and look, we don't study George Washington's farewell address in public schools, so let's study this, and it would be really good for us, right? It'll help appreciate Christian faith. Really? Is that what George Washington really meant?
So Washington wrote the following to Baptists in 1789. Washington, this is what Washington said. If I could now conceive that the general government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one will be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. Every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience.
That's right. That would include Jewish folk, Muslim folk, other non-Christian folk, non-theists. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, Washington wrote other pieces with the same idea to Methodists, Quakers, Presbyterians, Catholics, Jews. And yes, he is saying religion is really important to the general public, right? But he meant it in a general sense. Like, look, we have to be shaped by other ideas of the moral life, the good life. But he doesn't mean that Christian faith should have this privileged role in American society or law. So you want to read the Treaty of Tripoli?
Negotiated under George Washington and ratified by the Senate under John Adams, declared, the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. It's right there.
It is. David Barton is cherry picking, right? Like phrases out from actual documents, which again, plenty of people spoke with appreciation about religion. Of course they did. And that's why they wanted to have the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, like freedom of religious conscience. This is what we're trying to protect. And that is the wall of separation between church and state, which Jefferson later referred to, and that he wants to overcome. So yeah, this is dangerous. In 2015, the Iowa religious right group, the Family Leader, which is a key player in the GOP's First in the Nation caucus, had a new plan to encourage lawmakers in Iowa to, quote, do what God has asked them to do. And so they were fundraising to purchase $100 copies of the Bible, which, not surprisingly, is published by him, right? It's called the Founder's Bible. It's annotated by Barton with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and thoughts on our Judeo-Christian history as a nation.
I'm sorry. I smell a grift. He wants everyone to buy $100 copies of the Bible with his name on it. I'm about done with guys putting their name on Bibles. I smell a grift.
It is a grift, isn't it? And yet look at how influential he continues to be. New Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, although he may not be Speaker for long, he like totally upholds David Barton, speaks of him with great appreciation. He said, I was introduced to David and his ministry a quarter century ago, and it has had such a profound influence on me and my work and my life and everything I do.
Right.
Just whitewashing U.S. history.
Right. I've been in a lot of conservative and evangelical spaces where people will say things like, we are a Christian nation, and, whatever righty talking points that there might be. And mostly I kind of let those just happen because what am I going to say to those people? Nothing. Barton says that in Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States, Justice Brewer cited 87 precedents to prove the point that the United States is a Christian nation. But what Justice Brewer is saying is that the United States is, quote, Christian, and that some of the traditions are rooted in Christianity, not that Christianity gets legal privileges. There's incredibly bad, almost thinking errors and bad scholarship that goes on in these evangelical spaces where you think that everything's all Christian. And it's like, well, I mean, a lot of you are, but it doesn't mean that like we are a theocracy. And there's a lot of weirdness swirling around that point. And people like Barton try to sort of be like, hello, I'm a historian with no degree or training in history, but like, here I am, and tell you stuff that makes you think that he's right.
And so when you read the actual case of Holy Trinity versus the United States, this statement about being a Christian nation, it happens because Holy Trinity Church was contracting to hire a minister from England to come over in a time when Congress had limited immigration, right? And so it's in this context where the justice says, yes, we're a Christian nation. And it's a gratuitous statement. It has nothing to bear on the legality of the case.
Right.
And each of these so-called 87 precedents that David Barton points to, they were not case decisions. They're just examples from of statements that were descriptive, not prescriptive, right? And cultural, not legal.
It's more propaganda and greeting card level of detail than it is historical.
Greeting card level of detail. Yes, yes. When our faith is grounded in good history, and why would you undermine yourself and your credibility and your Christian witness by playing this grift? It's infuriating.
It is.
Well, let's continue with more Jeopardy.
All right, another Jeopardy. This fictional character is the everyman target for modern church growth.
Ooh, I know. Saddleback Sam. Saddleback Sam. So a few decades ago, I think in the 70s, there was folks who were in the study of missions, of Christian missions as a subject. Donald Macgavran, C. Peter Wagner, and others who held up Saddleback Sam, this white guy in a suit, sipping a latte. And
I don't think he had a latte. I don't
oh,
know the thing yet, but he had a pager and an old cell phone. It's bad even without the latte.
right. We weren't drinking lattes then. We were still
Oh.
drinking Folgers and U-Ban from Instant Grounds.
Oh,
Oh, it's
you're
terrible.
older than me. I don't know what happened to you. I'm so sorry for your coffee background.
Still recovering from the trauma. But the important thing about them is they said, look, this is how this person looks. I mean, setting aside maleness, whiteness, age, the fact that he lived in the suburbs and drove a car that was fueled by leaded gasoline at the time.
We're not going to get into everyone being lead poisoned.
Yes. Essentially said these were missiologists, the theorists about Christian mission, who just said, you look at the culture as it is, you don't ask any questions about whether Christians have any responsibility, moral responsibility for like why it's this way. And then you just accept it, right? So basically you just whitewash the past. You just made the past completely irrelevant. And that's really important, right? Because the white suburbs were totally a creation of a racist federal government who denied like black veterans from World War II GI Bill loans, where they gave them, all these white people loans, white veterans loans, and all these Levitowns and other town suburbs were developed. The construction companies got federal assistance. The individual homeowners got federal assistance. The federal government built roads and then interstate highways and then helped out the automotive industry. And so all these problems of, look, the white suburbs are not financially sustainable. Like, they can't even collect enough tax revenue to repair the roads after 20 or 30 years. Like, this is a huge problem. Not to mention, like, the ecological problems, the racial segregation, the fact that, okay, public schools built on top of racially segregated neighborhoods are going to be unequal. Like, all of these problems just don't, never mind the man behind the curtain, never mind how the church played a role in creating all these problems. And maybe we have some moral obligation to repent. Never mind. Like, you just look at Saddleback Sam and say, how do we reach this guy with Jesus?
It's interesting to place this right next to David Barton's fake history historian, whatever he was doing, because it's sort of, David Barton is like, hey, have you heard about the past? And we're like, yeah. And he's like, well, let me tell you about it. And it's wrong. But now we're sort of treating, when Saddleback Sam enters the picture, we're acting like it's Sim City. And we start with just sort of like this, land of opportunity. It's just grass and you have to build the roads and things just pop up. You click and it pops and it pops and it pops. And then you have people living there. And then you decide to do like zone for industry and zone for office. And as if nothing ever existed before, as if there is no history, as if this is brand new and you got a brand new earth and there's nothing to think about. You're just going to build wherever you want. So we have fake history or no history.
That's a really great point. That's a really great point, Haley. Sadly, this is kind of a repeated mistake, or maybe a willful error that a lot of Christian leaders seem to make. Another example is R.J. Rushdoony, who's really important to a certain wing of the Presbyterian movement, and he's famous for what's called Christian Reconstructionism, like the using Old Testament law in some weird, twisted way to try to impose theocracy. And he was so bad in his history that this is Kevin DeYoung who writes for the Gospel Coalition and 9 Marks, who we would not say, like, we're big fans of these organizations for their support of the idea of divine retributive justice and other things. But even he critiques R.J. Rushdoony as historically incompetent. Actually, he's quoting another guy, Carl Trueman, who calls Rushdoony historically incompetent and unhinged because Rushdoony rejects interracial marriage and says the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust has been exaggerated by the millions. Like, why do Christian leaders say these things? They're reputation laundering.
Yes, they are. And more on PSA later, more on retributive justice later.
So you've said this has been going on a long time. How long has it been going on, Haley?
Double Jeopardy time. That leads us to our next Daily Double. This person said that the colony, American colony, was a planting or plantation of God, like Israel was planted.
Oh, who is John Cotton? John Cotton's God's Plantation. That is a famous sermon among Puritans, almost as popular as John Winthrop's City on a Hill sermon. But this is a quote from a Puritan leader.
Have special care that you ever have the ordinances planted amongst you, or else never look for security. As soon as God's ordinances cease, your security ceaseth likewise. But if God plant his ordinances among you, fear not, he will maintain them. Upon all their glory there shall be a defense, that is, upon all God's ordinances. For so was the ark called the glory of Israel.
What's really important there that we want our audience to recognize is that they put themselves into the story of Israel, right? Where God is planting Israel in a new garden land. And I think that was an important part of the biblical story. I mean, I stand by that. I think that Jesus, but it's because God needed an Israel to be like this medical focus group to live safely on a land so that when Jesus came, he could have a real human experience, right? As a child, coming into a family with a tradition and a way to understand like what is my vocation, what is God called me to be and to do, that relates to what Israel was supposed to do, which is, yes, to press the commands of God so deeply into their human nature that they cut something away from human nature that shouldn't have been there, the corruption of sin. The biblical idiom that dominates that is circumcision of the heart. Cut something away from the heart that is sinful. Yes, that is true. But when Jesus comes, that period is over and we become exiles, foreigners, and aliens. That's First Peter and Hebrews 11 especially. But Jesus says, like, I have no place to lay my head. What the Puritans are doing is saying, we want to claim a land. So let's reach back in any part of is there any part of the Bible that we can insert ourselves into, right? So they are co-opting the Jewish story and they're inserting themselves in there. And then they get into this weird fear-based approach to God. Oh, maybe God will actually take away his protection or kick us out of the land or do these things. And they get into all these convolutions of their thought. And they're not sure what God's character is. But in any case, I mean, the real problem is that our final home is the renewed world that Jesus is going to bring with him, right? Like, or the renewal that Jesus will bring with him when he comes back. Like, up until then, in a sense, we are pilgrims, right? We are travelers. So this inspired a lot of fear of God, and they entered into this view of Native Americans were like opponents of ours. We can't really trust them, admit them into our culture. So I mean, everything got all screwed up because they thought they had to be like this politically covenanted nation, this Christian nation. And it was a total contradiction in terms.
Right. Well, if you live in this poverty mindset of like, maybe God will take everything I have from me because you misplaced yourself in the story of scripture and you see yourself as something that you're not, it's going to get really convoluted.
Right. And then you just keep laundering the reputation over and over.
You have to do a lot of things so you can sleep at night at that point, and then it's bad.
I want another daily double.
Okay. All right. I got more. This man said, all Abraham Lincoln had to do was to call for men, and how speedily they came. When he called for 600,000 men, how quick they sprang up all over the nations.
Who is Dwight L. Moody?
You're right.
Dwight L. Moody.
Mm.
What a liar.
Ooh, I think people will be mad at you for that.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry, folks in Chicago who go to, Moody Bible Institute and all.
No, you're not. You're not.
Like, so let's get the facts straight. When Abraham Lincoln called for troops from the North to go fight the Civil War, yes, there were a lot of Northerners who, quote, sprang up, but not to defend the Union. They sprang up to resist enlistment, and they sprang up to assault African Americans in the North. So look up the New York draft riots of 1863, for instance. You get large mobs of New York's white working class murdering over 100 Black people and destroying an orphanage that cared for Black children. And there's just like example after example of deeply racist, troubling resistance to Lincoln. But Dwight Moody, reputation laundered the North.
So the North, I'm sorry, when I learned U.S. history, I'll have you know that I learned that there was a line It was a very straight line. And it meant that everyone who was below the line was bad, depending on where you learned this history. And everyone above the line was good. And all the people above the line, it was that easy. They were like, no, slavery is bad, without exception, all of them up there. And then all the people below were like, but it's good. And we want to, have slaves. So you're telling me that that's not true?
No, that may even be a product of Dwight L. Moody's influence. Right. I mean, to some degree, and here's the thing. He wanted to just reputation launder the Civil War and the reasons for the Civil War. And he did that even more. Yeah, so he did that for the North, but he did that even more for the South, right? Because he was this kind of traveling evangelist, and he wanted to go everywhere, north, south, west, and so he wanted to ignore the plight of Black people in the South, right? Because what was happening, Jim Crow, their economic well-being was being stripped away, their political rights, their voting rights were being stripped away. But Moody would just go and flatter the white people, right? So he praised the courage and commitment of Confederate soldiers as if the cause that they fought for was morally equivalent to the North, or it's just negligible and abstract, right? It's like what mattered is y'all had courage. It's like, well, what mattered is the cause you fought for. Of course, that would be popular in the South, but it was popular in the North because at that point, the North didn't want to keep upholding Reconstruction. Right? Like that was a huge commitment to try to keep putting federal troops in the South, and huge expenditure. And the North just didn't want that responsibility. They didn't want soul searching. They didn't want, deeper repentance.
Right. I always remember how people said, and people would say this in churches, this Moody quote of like, why polish the rails on a sinking ship? That's legit. If I'm on a ship and it's sinking, I am not going to polish the rails. 100%. I'm gonna save myself, save people, like makes total sense. But the earth that we live on is not a sinking ship.
That's right. That's right.
It's if you can't see how that's way too simplistic and that is not loving your neighbor, then you need more help than what our videos can provide to you.
Right.
That's not it. People are still saying this. And so you don't get loving your neighbor or have any like reflections on how you use your economic power and how you use your political power. You're just like trying to like quickly, cheaply convert people, get some, people to walk an aisle and like believe and like raise their hands for Christ, or whatever they're doing. Right.
Right.
And so, yeah, why are you going to defend civil rights for people? If all you need to do is be like, do you believe Jesus? And they're like, yes. And you're like, great, thanks, bye. Because why polish the rails on a sinking ship? Why make life better for anybody? Why protect the environment? Why be kind to your neighbor? Why do any of that? Just walk around and convert people. There doesn't even need to be racial equity.
Right. And he was really responsible for reducing people down to souls and not bodies.
Right.
Right. And the way he did was by killing any kind of Christian virtue ethics, framing of like, this is what it means to be human. And what that means for our audience, virtue ethics is the idea that we struggle to do good in order to become good, right? Like we struggle to be honest in order to become honest. We are participating in the virtues, the things, the character of Christ. That's what we're participating in. So when we love our neighbor, it's because it has an effect on us. We are becoming loving people. And that's what he totally forgot, right? Like by saying it's not really important anymore. And, other people have explored premillennial dispensationalism, things like the rapture, which is nonsense. But essentially, it's the view that the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Jesus in Revelation 20, there's just doom and gloom on this side of that, right? So we don't expect the church to do anything. We can't change society, so why even try?
Yeah,
Again,
why polish the rails on a sinking ship? It's a ship that's sinking. You're going to be in the water. Just get some confessions. And of course you can be a jerk as long as people would just be like, yes, I believe in Jesus, and you just move on. It doesn't really matter what you do then, because it doesn't matter that you are formed into a person who knows to do the right thing even when it's hard to do, which is usually something a little self-sacrificial and loving for somebody else. None of that matters.
that's right. And that's why you heard what you heard.
I was thinking about whenever I've been in some scenario of like, hey, there's something up with my life and I'm really working on making this better and I want to thrive and I want things to be good. And people are like, why are you so worried about this life? You should be worried about the next. You should be more heavenly minded than they're doing all that sort of stuff. And I'm like, I think my life now matters too. And it feels a little Gnostic. Can you talk
Yeah.
to us about that?
Yeah. So what the way Moody portrayed that our souls as so much more important than our bodies led to a kind of Gnosticism or a semi-Gnosticism where it's not important how your body relates to someone else's body. Like, especially when it comes to economics or the sharing of wealth, that fit the situation where there was a rejection of Reconstruction, right? We don't want to help the bodies of our Black brothers and sisters. We don't want to think of the bodies of other people who were marginalized by the United States, right? On account of race or gender. But I mean, this is the period before women's suffrage. So there's kind of well, what matters is your soul. Just worry about your soul.
Oh yeah, I've heard that as a woman. I've
Yeah.
heard that my experience, my embodiment here doesn't matter at all. And that's very convenient for pretty much everybody but me in my life. If I can say like, my body doesn't matter, then guess what? Anyone who doesn't believe that really can take advantage of me, and that's not okay.
Right. I mean, they could pay you low wages. You could live in substandard housing or just
Right.
a terrible neighborhood
Right.
with lots of pollution. And who cares?
Right.
It's
And
no,
then when I get cancer or asthma or diabetes because I've eaten a bunch of food that has hidden sugar in it or something, I shouldn't be worried about my body. Because why polish the rails on a sinking ship? Every day I'm just one day closer to death. Why should I worry about it at all?
and that is semi-Gnosticism, right? And it's really important that to point out that before Dwight Moody, before the Civil War, there were other traveling evangelists who would say, "Come to Jesus, come down the aisle because we want to sign you up for abolition." Right? That's really different.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to say this to David Barton when I go to his house and chain up his fridge. I'm like, why polish the rails on a sinking ship? Why do you need to eat? I'm going to use this against him.
Right. I'm more civilized.
Yeah.
Okay, Haley, I get to ask you a daily double Jeopardy time. This person said, quote, "Defeat is the discipline which trains the truly heroic soul to further and better endeavors."
Well, as someone in Virginia, that would be Reverend Moses Drury Hoge in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the South.
Ooh, the former capital of the Confederacy. When did he say that and why?
So in the book by Charles Reagan Wilson called Baptized in Blood, The Religion of the Lost Cause. Oh, that title. Oh, The Religion of the Lost Cause.
Well, it is a religion.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is talking about October 26, 1875 in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. And they were dedicating the first statue in the South to the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson. Confederate traitor General Stonewall Jackson. It is a statue to a loser of the war who was a traitor to his country. Because I don't even like Confederate anymore. They're just traitors, right? Listen.
That's right.
The activities began early, with the city's natives and numerous visitors scurrying to obtain the best places from which to view the events of the day. At 11 o'clock, the procession, the largest Richmond had ever seen, started moving through the streets, arriving at the Capitol grounds an hour and a half later. Almost 50,000 people had gathered for the occasion. Stonewall Jackson was a quintessential Confederate martyr hero to Southern ministers. So when the first statue to him was dedicated, they helped make the occasion a religious one. The procession had included representatives from the Baptist Richmond College and from the denominational societies. Seated on the platform were several clergymen: Robert Louis Dabney, the reconstructed Presbyterian theologian who had served on Jackson's staff, the Reverend J. D. Smith, also of the general staff, Methodist Bishop D. S. Doggett, who gave the invocation, and the day's orator, the Reverend Moses Drury Hoge.
Now, before that, I know the governor of Virginia, James Kemper, said something where he said a few words where he called Stonewall Jackson like
a Christian warrior who would be an inspiration, teaching the power of courage and conscience and faith directed to the glory of God.
Wow. A Christian warrior. Yeah. That sounds like an insurrectionist. All right. I just want our audience to remember that this is at this huge public celebration, right? Like it's as big as any, Super Bowl victory parade of that day. Like this is the biggest thing that had happened to Richmond.
Yeah.
So that day.
A big losers parade.
Yeah. It's also important to know that Reverend Hoge was pastor of Richmond's Second Presbyterian Church. He had served as spiritual advisor to many Confederate leaders. And it's also important background in general that a lot of white Southern clergy were chaplains to the Confederate Army during the Civil War, that there were lots of events, lots of ministry, lots of quote unquote conversions. And Hoge himself had served as volunteer chaplain at the training camp just outside of Richmond. So he had seen a total of 100,000 Confederate soldiers just before they embarked on their first combat experiences. He preached at that training camp at least 3 times a week, sometimes every day. And so the Southern defeat had crushed Hoge.
I can read the next part. In May 1865, 1 month before Appomattox, he wrote to his sister that, quote, God's dark providence enwraps me like a pall. Shattered were his dreams of a, quote, gospel guarded against the contamination of New England infidelity, end quote. As a result, he felt, quote, like a shipwrecked mariner thrown up like seaweed on a desert shore, end quote. His depression and accompanying physical illness continued for a year or so, but eventually he reassured himself that, despite defeat, the South had not been wrong in the war.
They had not been wrong in the war. Like they were defeated. And I guess if you're, a high Presbyterian at that time, you really believe that God does everything, right? Like the South had not been wrong. So then what did he say, right? Like as he gets up to give this speech.
Yeah. He said, and if history teaches any lesson, I'm sorry, I have to pause for commentary. If they just lost the war, keep going. It is this, that a nation cannot long survive when the fundamental principles which gave it life originally are subverted. It is true, republics have often degenerated into despotisms. It is also true that after such transformation, they have for a time been characterized by a force, a prosperity, and a glory never known in their earlier annals. But it has always been a force which absorbed and obliterated the rights of the citizen, a prosperity which was gained by the sacrifice of individual independence, a glory which was ever the precursor of inevitable anarchy, disintegration, and ultimate extinction.
So this is why he thought the South had been right, because it stood for liberty, the individual's liberty. Oh my goodness. That's a lot of whitewashing.
I really don't believe when I've had friends who want to play, let's pretend like it's the olden days, or let's pretend like we want it to be the olden days. I always kind of have to be like, that wouldn't have gone so well for me. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, because I probably would have been enslaved. And they're like, oh, now you're ruining our fun. But it's not liberty for everybody. It's liberty for a few people and not for a lot of other people. It didn't work that way. We've talked about this in earlier videos. There was a very small class of people who enslaved a bunch of people to do all the work for them. And then most of the other people were not enslaved. They're extremely poor. It didn't work. The
That's
whole
right.
thing didn't work. They lost a whole entire war. And then they were like, boo-hoo, we lost. But we were right. We did lose, but we were right. And they get to be the victims and they get to be right. They get to be the victims of losing their own war and they still get to be right somehow. That's really convenient.
And notice, like, once you insert yourself into the story of Israel, ancient Israel in the Old Testament,
Mm.
you can't interpret your circumstances like this, right? Like, why, when Israel lost, why did they? It's because really they were going after other gods. They wanted to worship other gods and be like other people. And so they made treaties with other people and said, we don't need God's protection. We just want to make treaties with, let's say, Babylon. And so God said, okay, well, then I'm going to let you go do that, right? Like, you made this exchange, so I'm going to give you over to that choice. I'm going to let you experience what that really is like. So Babylon comes, takes over, and Israel then learns something about, maybe we were wrong,
Mm-hmm.
right? They learned that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But the Southerner doesn't, or at least Reverend Hoge doesn't, and those who believe him don't. Instead, they get to, as you said, be the victim and be right and say, this is why the South will rise again. This is why the South must rise again, because we are going to have to rescue the U.S. from those ungodly New Englanders. Yeah, okay. And so you have these leaders of the Southern Church here on this stage, reputation laundering the South. And this is the religion of the lost cause.
There's almost no better example of this. Like, I lost a war. Like, we just had a Super Bowl. The losers did not get whatever thing they get at the end of the Super Bowl. If you win it, probably a trophy or something. You don't give the trophy to the loser. Only the winner gets a trophy. If the losers are like, we should have won, and then they make their own winning sort of ceremony, which is actually a loser ceremony with their own statues or like whatever awards that they get, then we'd be like, oh,
Right.
don't do that. That's kind of embarrassing. But they did it anyway.
They did it anyway. And they say, like, we're the true heroes of this story because, I don't know, because we're still standing against this large federal government, right? The federal government that's interfering with our white supremacy, really. But look, we'll just say that it's the federal government, right? A nation cannot long survive when the fundamental principles that give it life, which is the rights of the citizen, because Black people were never citizens.
Right. Yes.
Therein lies the rub.
It's literally the church being the reputation launderer for the plantation.
Right.
Actually, literally, the church laundering for the plantation owners.
Right. And then this sets up why it is that Southern states should continue resisting the federal government's quote unquote interference with their white supremacy, with Jim Crow and all these other injustices that they are dealing out because they refuse to admit, like, we were morally wrong. And it is so awful. In the North, I mean, there were some other things, just to not leave the North behind as well at around this time. B.B. Warfield was the only voice at Princeton Theological Seminary for racial integration and equality quite some time. There's another guy, J. Gresham Machen, also at Princeton. He was founder of the OPC, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Now, I mean, he may have become kind of passively white supremacist rather than actively white supremacist. I know some people will try to defend him in his later life in the 20s and 30s. Okay, fine, but it cannot be doubted that he was a staunch libertarian. And so there is a way, right, of becoming a libertarian conveniently, because you also don't want the government to do anything about other injustices, right? So he opposed things like public education. So fee is this it's the Foundation for Economic Education. It's a libertarian organization, totally owns J. Gresham Machen and calls him a forgotten libertarian. So this is what the libertarian article from Fee says about J. Gresham Machen. Historian George Marsden refers to Machen's political views as, quote, radically libertarian. He opposed almost any extension of state power and took stands on a variety of issues. Like most libertarians, his stances violated usual categories of liberal or conservative. Following the impulses of his family heritage, which was rooted in the South, Machen tended to place state sovereignty before that of the federal government. In letters, he indicated a belief that the Southern states properly exercised their constitutional authority to attempt secession. Most importantly, Machen favored individual rights and families over governmental powers. Machen detested governmental control of individuals, as he stated in the introduction of his book, Christianity and Liberalism. Personality can only be developed in the realm of individual choice, and that realm in the modern state is being slowly but steadily eradicated. See, there it is, the view that freedom means freedom from, as opposed to freedom to, like freedom to participate in a democracy, in a community where no one interferes with your freedom to participate. Instead, Machen defines freedom as freedom from other people. Machen mentioned no words of the, quote, dreary regularity of one of his favorite nature preserves after the federal government made it a national park. Machen wrote, I almost feel as though I were in some kind of penal institution. I feel somewhat as I do when I'm in Los Angeles or any of the overregulated cities of the West, where pedestrians meekly wait around on the street corners for non-existent traffic and cross the streets only at the sound of the prison gong. And on it goes. I mean, the whole article is really worth reading.
So libertarians were doing we don't like public schools a while ago, as they still now are.
Yep. That's right.
That's time.
Yeah. And somehow you believe, oh, it's not the government's right or role or prerogative to actually provide for the common defense and common good. Right. So
more double jeopardy time.
Let's move on. Yes.
All right. This is a long one. Pay attention. This man founded an organization called Spiritual Mobilization in order to fight FDR's New Deal regulations that drew in lay people and corporate leaders like J. Howard Pugh Jr., president of Sun Oil, and eventually laying the groundwork for Billy Graham and setting a pattern of conservative Christians aligning with fossil fuel.
Who is James W. Fifield Jr.?
You are right.
Yes, we have covered him or mentioned him before. It is striking. So continuing on with this theme of Christians and libertarianism, he promoted Christian libertarianism. He did not like the New Deal, didn't like the regulations, and so he gathered some Protestant leaders and activists, because Catholics generally liked FDR and the New Deal, which is interesting. But he called the New Deal communist. And so, yeah, this started a pattern. Basically, he continued the argument that, oh, Christianity is only for individual choices, right? Like, and individual freedoms.
Yes, I remember that Bible verse that said that. It's only for individual choice and individual freedoms, and I don't have to pay for your public schools for your kids. I remember those verses.
Right. Jesus saw the little children and said, "These aren't mine."
I will turn down federal funds for school lunches for these little children because they need. I'm going to stop.
Oh, don't stop. I mean, let them eat nothing and go into student like lunch debt.
Let the little
Lunch debt.
children work in a chicken factory all night long and don't give them food. That's what Jesus said.
I remember that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, that's depressing. Let's move on to the next one.
You want another double jeopardy?
Yeah.
Okay. This person added the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, printed "In God We Trust" on U.S. currency, and started the National Prayer Breakfast.
Who is George Washington?
No, you are wrong. It is Dwight Eisenhower.
Dwight Eisenhower? No.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, you are right. You corrected me there. It was only in the 1950s, right? Like, and Protestants were signing up, tripping over themselves in order to support the Cold War.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so against the Soviet Union. And so Eisenhower was a generic Protestant. It's interesting. He was also on the board of Planned Parenthood.
I didn't know that.
Embarrassing for people today, Protestants today. But anyway, yeah, he wanted to tie together a general sense of Christian duty with the Cold War, the U.S. Kind of on the side of God and freedom and capitalism, and so he started all these things. And he was a disappointment to the libertarians, right? Because he was like, let's use the federal government to make interstate roads and, like electronics, the defense.
Your own roads. If you want to drive, pull up your bootstraps and make your own roads.
Make your own roads.
Individual. You just hear the Bible. I told you about being an individual. Make your own roads. Stop being so lazy.
Yeah, right. Oh, well, and Kristen Kobus-Dumais and Kevin Cruz talk about but it was still kind of a win for like the people who were getting on the bandwagon for Christian nationalism, because then they could say, look how long "In God We Trust" has been on our money as we worship the dollar.
Not that long.
Yeah.
Right.
The dollar is an icon, right? Like it just opens a window into God.
Yeah.
Truly.
More double jeopardy?
Yes, I think this will be our last one.
This pastor of the largest congregation in the Southern Baptist Convention at the time, First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas, gave a fiery sermon admonishing his fellow Southern Baptist pastors to defend racial segregation, and in 1961 taught the curse of Ham theory from Genesis 9.
Who is W.A. Criswell?
Yes, you got that one
Oh,
right.
yeah, one of the predecessors of Robert Jeffress over there. Good old First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. Yeah, this was part of the white backlash to the civil rights movement. They were fighting Brown v. Board. That is just amazing. Fighting Brown v. Board, 1954. And you know who they thought were heretical? There are other Christians who favored integration. I mean, yeah, things like
Remain unsurprised. I just remain unsurprised.
Yeah. This is what Carolyn DuPont says in her book, Mississippi Praying. Northern Protestants, they believed, had corrupted the pure and simple gospel of salvation by forsaking strict biblical interpretation. Yeah, right, because Ham was black.
It's just racism. Racism really explains most things in this country. Most things.
Yeah, well, that and the theory of divine retributive justice that just keeps punishing people and never lets them out of jail. That too. Yeah.
More on that later.
Yep. And so by forsaking strict biblical interpretation, discarding their zeal to save lost souls. Oh, there's the Dwight Moody influence. And striving to improve conditions in the present world.
Yeah,
Ooh, see,
why
they didn't
polish
like that.
the brass on the sinking ship, which apparently gets expanded to why allow children who aren't white to be educated. It's just racism.
Right. So a few years later in 1969, what's really interesting is that Criswell changed his tune. He was elected president of the SBC, the Southern Baptists, and then he modified his view of race in America. He said, everyone is welcome to his church, but I do not want to change any social or legal structures. So here's what an article by Freeman says about this. For Criswell, as for many other white conservative evangelicals in America, racism was limited to individual level prejudice and discrimination, right? So people can be racist, but, you know, the housing system or the criminal justice system can't be racist. Like systems can't be racist,
Right.
or have racial injustices embedded already. To the extent that something changed in him, it was at the interpersonal level. And if all individuals were similarly to change, there would be no race problem. Isn't that an amazing idea? Like the most Christian part of the country has the worst race problems,
Right.
the South, and continues to say, well, we just need more people to become Christians, and then our race problem will be solved. How exactly?
Very giving no true Scotsman, but in like a psychotic way. It's not
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and it must be because they have a reputation laundered version of the gospel, of the church, of U.S. history, of your own experience of injustice, and they want to launder that away.
So people can be racist individually, but probably only if they say things that are like very explicitly racist, like, hello, I'm a racist. But other than that, they're not. But the things that people make together, if lots of them are racist, can't be racist.
It makes so much sense.
Yeah, that's how things work.
Right. All right. So what did we just cover in the session? We talked about the church as the reputation launderer of the plantation system, especially the church elite, back scratch the plantation elite. That's what we mean by the church is the high priest and false prophet of the plantation system. And part 2 will cover more of these dynamics as we go into the abuse of women and prosperity theology as well, and look at the white evangelical church as, on the whole, as a plantation theology.
Well, that's all we have time for today, but join us next time for session 11, part 2, the church as a plantation's high priest and false prophet.